Have you ever stood beneath a sky so filled with stars that you felt your soul tremble, like the heavens were whispering secrets just beyond your grasp? Imagine now not stars but rivers of gold glinting in the torchlight of a hidden tomb, untouched for millennia, wrapped in silence and sand, waiting for someone to ask why. Why did the pharaohs of ancient Egypt bury their dead with mountains of gold, enough to feed a kingdom, arm an army, build a city? Was it vanity? Was it faith? Or was it something far more complex, something woven into the very fabric of their understanding of life, death, and what comes after? If you have ever wondered how a civilization could pour such staggering wealth into the earth, believing it would travel with them into eternity, then you are not alone. Today, we are going deep, not just into the tombs of the pharaohs, but into the mind of a culture that saw death not as an end, but as a doorway. And before we descend into the Valley of the Kings, into the glittering darkness where Tutankhamun slept for over 3,000 years, take a moment, drop a comment below. What would you take with you into the afterlife? And if you are ready to explore one of history's most haunting questions, do not forget to subscribe, because this journey through time, belief, and buried treasure is only just beginning. Long before the pyramids became postcards of mystery, before Herodotus scribbled notes about mummies and magic, before Howard Carter's trembling hand brushed dust from a gilded face in 1922, the people of the Nile had already answered a question that still haunts humanity. What happens when we die? For the ancient Egyptians, death was not annihilation, it was transition. The soul did not vanish, it embarked. And like any wise traveler preparing for a perilous journey across deserts and divine courts, one needed provisions. Not just bread and beer, not just sandals and ointments, but power. Divine authority made tangible in the form of gold. To understand why the pharaohs were buried with staggering quantities of this luminous metal, we must first understand that gold was not mere wealth to them. It was sacred. It was the flesh of the gods. The sun god Ra, who sailed across the sky each day in his solar bark, was said to have skin of gold and bones of silver. Gold never tarnished, never decayed, never dimmed, unlike everything else in the mortal world. While grain rotted, while linen frayed, while even the strongest stone weathered under the desert wind, gold remained eternal. And so, if a pharaoh wished to become a god in the afterlife, if he sought to join Ra in his celestial voyage, he too must be adorned in the substance of eternity. This was not greed, it was theology. It was cosmology, it was necessity. The earliest evidence of this belief stretches back to the dawn of Egyptian civilization itself, to the first dynasty around 3,100 years before the birth of Christ. At the necropolis of Abydos, archaeologists have uncovered royal tombs lined with chambers filled not only with the bodies of servants, some perhaps sacrificed to accompany their king, but with jars, furniture, weapons, and ornaments of gold leaf and solid electrum. Already, even in those primordial centuries, the pharaoh was being equipped for a life beyond life. But it was during the Old Kingdom, the age of the Great Pyramids, that this practice reached its first zenith. Consider the pyramid complex of Djoser at Saqqara, designed by the genius architect Imhotep, a structure not merely of stone, but of meaning. Beneath its stepped silhouette lay a labyrinth of corridors and chambers meant to mirror the pharaoh's celestial journey, and within those secret spaces, gold was everywhere. On the edges of ceremonial blades, in the eyes of protective statues, woven into the very threads of burial shrouds. Yet none of this gold was meant to be seen by living eyes again. That was the point. Its brilliance was for the gods, for the dead king's Ka, the vital essence that required sustenance, and for the judges of the underworld who would weigh his heart against the feather of man, the goddess of truth and cosmic order. As the centuries rolled on, the rituals deepened, the symbolism grew more intricate. By the time of the New Kingdom, around 1500 years before Christ, Egypt had become an imperial power, its borders stretching from the Euphrates to the fourth cataract of the Nile. With conquest came unimaginable wealth, and with wealth came even grander visions of the afterlife. The pharaohs of this era no longer built pyramids. They carved their tombs directly into the limestone cliffs of the Theban hills, in what we now call the Valley of the Kings. Here, hidden from robbers and the scorching sun, they created subterranean temples of resurrection. And in these tombs, gold was not merely present, it was overwhelming. Take the burial of Amenhotep III, grandfather of Tutankhamun, whose mummy may never be found, but whose funerary equipment, scattered across museums, speaks volumes. His sandals were inlaid with gold soles so that he would tread upon gold with every step in the afterlife. His finger and toe stalls, tiny sheaths to protect his extremities, were of pure gold because even the smallest part of his divine body must remain incorruptible. Every object was a prayer made solid. Every surface gleamed with intention. But why gold and not some other metal? Why not silver, which in many cultures held equal or greater value? For the Egyptians, silver was rare, rarer than gold in the early dynasties, because Egypt had no native silver mines. It had to be imported from the Levant or Anatolia, making it precious but foreign. Gold, by contrast, poured from the eastern deserts from Nubia to the south, a land whose very name in Egyptian, Nub, meant gold. The pharaohs controlled these mines with military garrisons and forced labor, sending expeditions across blistering wastes to extract the luminous metal that would ensure their immortality. In their worldview, gold was not just a resource. It was a divine birthright, a substance that connected the earthly throne to the celestial realm. When a pharaoh wore a gold Nemes headdress or held a gold crook and flail, he was not displaying wealth. He was manifesting his identity as a living god. And when he died, that identity must not falter. To bury him without gold would be to send him into the Jewet, the Egyptian underworld, naked, powerless, vulnerable to the demons that lurked in its 12 perilous hours of night. This belief reached its most dazzling expression in the tomb of Tutankhamun, the boy king whose reign was brief, but whose burial would become the most famous archaeological discovery in history. Discovered nearly intact in November of 1922 by Howard Carter and his patron Lord Carnarvon, the tomb was a time capsule of New Kingdom funerary practice. Within its 4 small chambers lay over 5,000 objects. And gold, oh, the gold, was everywhere. The innermost coffin alone weighed over 250 pounds of solid gold. The death mask, which has since become the icon of ancient Egypt, was fashioned from 2 layers of high-carat gold, inlaid with lapis lazuli, quartz, obsidian, and glass, its serene visage gazing eternally toward the afterlife. Around the king's neck lay pectorals depicting the vulture and cobra, symbols of Upper and Lower Egypt, crafted in cloisonné gold. Even his sandals, his gloves, his ceremonial daggers were gilded. But this was not hoarding. This was resurrection technology. Each object had a ritual purpose. The golden shrines that nested one within another like Russian dolls were not meant to protect the body from thieves. They were cosmic maps, inscribed with spells from the Book of the Dead, designed to guide the pharaoh through the trials of the underworld and into the field of reeds, a paradise of eternal abundance. And yet the question lingers. Was it all truly about faith, or did politics play a role as well? Consider this. The more gold a pharaoh took with him, the less remained in the hands of the living, particularly the priesthood and the nobility. By channeling vast resources into the tomb, the king asserted his supremacy even in death. He reminded everyone that his power was not of this world alone. Moreover, the act of burial was a public spectacle, a reaffirmation of cosmic order. The funeral procession, the recitation of spells, the sealing of the tomb, all were witnessed by priests, courtiers, and scribes who would carry the memory forward. The gold, though hidden, was known. Its existence was legend. And legend, in a society built on man, on balance, truth, and divine harmony, was as real as stone. But here is where the story grows darker. For all their precautions, for all their spells and secret passages, almost every royal tomb was robbed within decades, sometimes within years of burial. The workers who built the tombs, the priests who performed the rites, the officials who sealed the doors, many of them were the very ones who later tunneled back in under cover of night, prying open shrines, melting down statues, stripping gold from mummies with cold efficiency. Papyri from the 20th dynasty record trials of tomb robbers, men who confessed to entering tombs like thieves in the night, who spoke of finding the pharaoh's mummy still wearing his golden mask, and who described how they divided the gold among themselves. The state responded with brutal punishments, impaling, mutilation, execution, but the temptation was too great. Gold buried was gold wasted in the eyes of the starving, the corrupt, the desperate. And so the pharaohs, in their quest for eternal life, created irresistible targets for the very mortality they sought to escape. Tutankhamun's tomb survived not because it was grander, but because it was smaller, hidden beneath the debris of workmen's huts and the later tomb of Ramesses VI. It was forgotten, truly forgotten, for over 3,000 years. And in that forgetting, it became the exception that proves the rule. The pharaohs buried gold not because they believed it would last forever in the earth, but because they believed it would be needed immediately in the next world. The afterlife began the moment the breath left the body. There was no waiting, no delay. The journey started at death, and the pharaoh had to be ready, armed with gold, guarded by spells, wrapped in linen soaked in sacred oils. Indeed, the story deepens when we look beyond the pharaohs themselves and into the hands that shaped their eternal image, the artisans, the embalmers, the priests who transformed a mortal man into a radiant god of gold. These were not anonymous laborers shuffling in the shadows. They were masters of a sacred craft, trained for decades in the esoteric arts of preservation and consecration. In the village of Deir el-Medina, nestled in a desolate valley opposite Thebes, lived the very men who carved the tombs of the New Kingdom pharaohs. Their homes, small and sun-baked, have yielded thousands of ostraca, limestone flakes and pottery shards inscribed with everything from grocery lists to love poems, but also with work logs, religious texts, and even complaints about delayed grain rations. These were human beings, fully aware of the staggering wealth they handled daily, yet bound by oaths of secrecy and devotion. They knew that to violate a tomb was not merely a crime against the state, it was a cosmic offense, a disruption of mad that could bring chaos upon the land. And yet, as the New Kingdom waned and Egypt's power crumbled under invasions, economic collapse, and priestly corruption, even these oaths began to fray. The burial of a pharaoh was not a single event, but a meticulously choreographed sequence spanning 70 days, the time needed for mummification. During this period, the body lay in a purification tent while priests recited the ritual of the hours, invoking the protection of Osiris, the god of the dead, and his sister wife Isis, who had reassembled her husband's dismembered body and breathed life back into him through magic. The embalmers, wearing masks of Anubis, the jackal-headed god of embalming, removed the brain through the nose with hooked instruments, extracted the internal organs, and placed them in canopic jars guarded by the 4 sons of Horus. The body was then packed in natron, a naturally occurring salt from the Wadi Natron, which slowly drew out moisture until the flesh became leathery and preserved. Only then was it ready for the final rites, anointing with myrrh and cedar oil, wrapping in hundreds of yards of linen, and adorning with amulets of lapis, carnelian, and, above all, gold. Gold amulets were not decorative. Each carried precise magical intent. The eye of Horus restored wholeness. The jed pillar symbolized stability. The scarab beetle placed over the heart bore an inscription from chapter 30b of the Book of the Dead. O my heart, do not rise up against me as a witness. Do not oppose me in the tribunal. Do not rebel against me before the guardian of the scales. This scarab, often carved from green stone but frequently rendered in gold for royalty, was meant to silence the heart during the weighing of the soul, ensuring it would not testify against its owner. And over the mummy's face, whether a simple cartonnage mask for a noble or a solid gold visage for a king, was placed the ultimate symbol of divine transformation, the idealized likeness of the deceased as a perfected, eternal being. But why gold specifically for the face? Because the face was the seat of identity. In Egyptian belief, to lose one's face in the afterlife was to cease to exist. Hence, tomb paintings show the deceased presenting their face to the gods, and spells in the coffin texts implore, "May my face be remembered." A gold mask ensured that the pharaoh's face would shine like the sun for all eternity. Recognizable to the gods, undeniable in its divinity. This is why when Howard Carter peered through a small hole into Tutankhamun's burial chamber and Lord Carnarvon asked, "Can you see anything?" Carter famously replied, "Yes, wonderful things." But what he saw first was not the mask, it was the glint of gold everywhere. The outermost shrine, over 16 feet long, was covered in gold leaf and inlaid with colored glass. The walls shimmered. The air itself seemed thick with the weight of sanctity. It was not a treasure hoard. It was a machine of resurrection, every gear turned by belief. And belief in ancient Egypt was not passive. It was performative. The spells inscribed on tomb walls were not merely read. They had to be spoken aloud by priests during the funeral and later recited by descendants during mortuary cult rituals. If the words were not spoken, the magic would not activate. The deceased would stumble in the duat, fail the tests, be devoured by the monstrous Ammon, the devourer of the dead, and cease to exist. Thus, the gold was not only for the gods' eyes, it was also for the living, a constant reminder of their duty to sustain the dead through offerings and incantations. Tombs included false doors, carved stone portals through which the ka could pass to receive food and drink from the living. Without these rituals, even a tomb filled with gold would be useless. Gold alone could not grant immortality. It required the continuous participation of the community, the family, the state. This interdependence between the living and the dead explains why royal tombs were clustered in specific necropolises: Saqqara, Dashur, Giza, Thebes. These were not random burial grounds. They were sacred landscapes, aligned with celestial events and mirroring the geography of the afterlife. The sun set in the west where the dead traveled, so all cemeteries lay on the western bank of the Nile. The eastern bank where the sun rose was reserved for the living, the temples, the palaces, the bustling markets. This spatial division reinforced the cosmic order. Life and death existed in balance, separated but connected. To bury a pharaoh was to anchor the nation in eternity. His successful transition to godhood ensured the Nile would flood, the crops would grow, and Egypt would endure. His failure would bring drought, famine, invasion. The stakes could not have been higher. By the time of the 19th dynasty, under pharaohs like Seti I and Ramesses II, the Valley of the Kings had become a necropolis of unparalleled sophistication. Seti I's tomb, KV 17, stretches over 400 feet into the mountain, with walls covered in vivid paintings of the Book of Gates, the Book of Caverns, and the Litany of Ra, esoteric texts that map the sun god's nightly journey through the 12 gates of the underworld. Here, gold appears not only on objects but in the very pigments. The yellow used to depict the sun bark and divine flesh was often made with powdered gold mixed into resin. Even the paint was sacred. Ramesses II, who reigned for 66 years and sired over 100 children, prepared for death with characteristic grandeur. His sarcophagus was carved from a single block of red granite, but his mummy was wrapped in linen soaked in resins and adorned with gold plaques stamped with protective deities. Though his tomb was looted in antiquity, his mummy survived, hidden by priests in a secret cache at Deir el-Bahari alongside dozens of other royal remains, its face still bearing the serene, ageless expression of divine kingship. Yet as Egypt entered its third intermediate period, around 1,070 years before Christ, the centralized power of the pharaohs began to dissolve. The high priests of Amen at Thebes grew so powerful that they ruled Upper Egypt as de facto kings, while rival dynasties vied for control in the Delta. In this fractured landscape, the old funerary traditions were both preserved and perverted. Pharaohs like Susen's-I of the 21st dynasty could not afford the vast expenditures of their New Kingdom ancestors, but they still needed to be buried as gods. So they reused sarcophagi from earlier rulers, refashioned jewelry, and melted down old gold to create new funerary masks. At Tanis in the Nile Delta, archaeologists discovered the intact tomb of Susenzai in 1939, a rare survival in the north, and found him lying in a silver coffin, silver now more accessible than in earlier times, with a gold mask that echoed Tutankhamun, though cruder in execution. The message was clear. The theology remained, but the resources had dwindled. Gold was still essential, but it was now recycled, borrowed, improvised. The twilight of the Pharaohs did not come with a sudden collapse, but with a slow erosion, an unraveling of the divine contract that had held Egypt together for over 3,000 years. As foreign powers began to cast their shadows over the Nile, Assyrians, Persians, Greeks, and eventually Romans, the sacred logic of gold burial faced its most profound challenge, not from thieves or economic strain, but from competing cosmologies. The Persians, who ruled Egypt briefly in the 27th dynasty, buried their kings in rock-cut tombs at Nakshi Rostam, but without the obsessive provisioning of the Egyptians. To them, the afterlife was a matter of ethical judgment, not material equipment. The Greeks, under Alexander the Great and his successors, admired Egyptian religion but filtered it through their own lens of hero cults and philosophical immortality. When Ptolemy I, one of Alexander's generals, declared himself pharaoh in 304 years before Christ, he and his descendants adopted the trappings of Egyptian kingship, building temples, commissioning statues, even being mummified, but their hearts belonged to Hellenistic ideals. The last true pharaoh to be buried with significant gold was likely Cleopatra VII, though her tomb has never been found. Legend says she was laid to rest beside her lover Mark Antony in a mausoleum near Alexandria, perhaps with Roman-style honors, perhaps with Egyptian rites. But if gold accompanied her, it vanished without a trace, swallowed by the shifting sands or the tides of time. Yet the practice did not die all at once. In the remote oases of the western desert, in the temples of Philae and Edfu, Egyptian priests continued to perform the old rituals well into the Roman period. The last known hieroglyphic inscription, carved at Philae in 394 years after Christ, speaks not of gold or tombs, but of the gods' enduring presence. By then, Christianity had taken root in Egypt, bringing with it a radically different view of death, not a journey requiring material aid, but a spiritual transition where the soul stood naked before God. Gold had no place in such a vision. The Coptic Christians who inherited the land of the Pharaohs saw the glittering tombs not as sacred, but as monuments of idolatry, temples to false gods who demanded wealth instead of humility. And so, over centuries, the memory of why the Pharaohs buried gold faded, replaced by tales of cursed treasures and greedy kings. But the truth was far more profound. To the ancient Egyptians, gold was never about showing off. It was about transformation. It was about ensuring that the pharaoh, who in life maintained the balance of the universe through ritual and justice, could continue that role in death. Without a divine king in the afterlife maintaining order among the gods, chaos, Isfet, would seep into the world of the living. Famine, disease, and rebellion would follow. Thus, burying gold was not self-indulgence. It was an act of cosmic responsibility. Every ounce of gold placed in a tomb was a stitch in the fabric of reality, a thread holding back the void. This is why even in times of poverty or foreign domination, the elite clung to the practice. A Middle Kingdom nobleman might not have a solid gold coffin, but he would have gold leaf on his mask, a gold ring on his finger, a gold amulet on his chest, because without it, he risked non-existence. Consider the psychological weight of this belief. Imagine growing up in a society where every sunset was a rehearsal for death, where every temple wall depicted the trials of the underworld, where children played near tombs and learned the spells of the Book of the Dead as part of their education. Death was not hidden, it was integrated, and gold was the bridge. It was the only substance that shared the qualities of the gods, incorruptible, radiant, eternal. Even the word for gold in ancient Egyptian, nub, carried connotations of splendor and divinity. To say someone was more golden than gold was the highest praise. And yet the ultimate irony is this. The very act of burying gold ensured that most of it would be lost, not to the afterlife, but to human hands. Tomb robbery was so rampant that by the 20th dynasty, royal mummies were being stripped not just of their gold, but of their very identities. Priests, in a desperate attempt to save what they could, gathered the desecrated remains of past pharaohs and reburied them in two secret caches, one at Deir el-Bahari, another at the tomb of Amenhotep II. There in hidden chambers they laid Tutankhamun's great-grandfather Amenhotep III next to Thutmose III, Seti I beside Ramesses II. Their golden masks gone, their bodies hastily rewrapped, their names barely legible on faded linen. These were not acts of reverence, but of salvage. The gold was gone, but perhaps the names could be preserved. Perhaps the memory of their divinity could endure. When Howard Carter finally uncovered Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922, he did not just find gold. He found a time capsule of a belief system so complete, so all-encompassing, that it had turned an entire civilization into architects of eternity. Every object in that tomb, from the golden throne depicting the young king being anointed by his wife Ankhesenamun, to the tiny gold sandals meant to protect his feet from the scorching sands of the Jewett, was part of a single, unified vision. That death was a passage, and the pharaoh must cross it not as a man, but as a god. And gold was the only language the gods truly understood. But what of the workers who made this vision real? What of the goldsmiths who hammered out the mask, the carpenters who built the shrines, the scribes who painted the spells? Their names are mostly lost, though a few survive, like Nakhemen, the chief artisan of Deir el-Medina during the reign of Horemheb, whose tomb contains a rare self-portrait showing him at work, chisel in hand. These men did not see themselves as mere craftsmen. They were participants in a sacred drama. To shape gold into the likeness of a god-king was to touch the divine. Their work was prayer. Their tools were holy. And though they were paid in grain, beer, and fish, they knew they were building something that would outlast empires. The deeper we descend into this golden labyrinth of belief, the clearer it becomes that the pharaohs' obsession with gold was not merely about their own survival. It was about the survival of Egypt itself. In the Egyptian worldview, the pharaoh was not just a political ruler. He was the living embodiment of Horus, the falcon god who triumphed over chaos, and upon his death he became Osiris, the resurrected lord of the underworld. This dual identity meant that his successful transition into the afterlife was not a private matter but a national imperative. If the pharaoh failed to become Osiris, if his heart was found heavy with sin, if his name was forgotten, if his body was desecrated, the entire cosmic order would falter. The Nile might not flood, the sun might not rise, the borders might crumble. Thus, the gold buried with him was not a luxury, it was infrastructure. It was as vital as irrigation canals or granaries. It was the unseen pillar holding up the sky. This understanding explains why, even during periods of foreign rule or internal strife, the funerary cults persisted with astonishing tenacity. When the Hyksos, Asiatic invaders, controlled the delta during the Second Intermediate Period, the native Egyptian rulers in Thebes continued to build tombs in the old style, clinging to the rituals that affirmed their legitimacy as true pharaohs. When the Amarna heresy briefly overturned the pantheon under Akhenaten, who worshipped only the sun disk Aten and abandoned the gold-laden temples of Amen, the backlash was swift and total. After Akhenaten's death, his name was erased from monuments, his city abandoned, and his son Tutankhamun, originally Tutankhamun, was rushed through a full restoration of the old gods. The gold flowed back into the temples. The statues of Amen were regilded. The tombs once again filled with the familiar symbols of Osiris and the afterlife. The return to orthodoxy was not just religious, it was a reassertion of cosmic stability. Gold became the visual language of that return. And yet, for all its spiritual weight, gold also served a very earthly function. It was the ultimate currency of legitimacy. In a society where literacy was limited to a small elite, where most people experienced the power of the pharaoh through spectacle and symbol, gold was an unmistakable sign of divine favor. When a new pharaoh ascended the throne, he did not merely inherit a kingdom. He inherited a sacred duty to outshine his ancestors in piety and provision. This created a kind of spiritual arms race. Each tomb had to be more elaborate than the last, each burial more lavishly equipped, not out of vanity but out of necessity. To do less would be to suggest weakness, not just politically but cosmically. Ramesses II, who ruled for so long that he outlived many of his children, filled the Valley of the Kings with monuments to his own eternity, but he also restored older tombs, reinscribed faded texts, and reconsecrated neglected shrines. He was not merely preserving history. He was reinforcing the chain of divine kingship that linked him to the first pharaoh, Narmer, and beyond. But what of the gold itself? Where did it truly come from, and at what cost? The mines of Nubia, particularly in the region of Wadi Alaki and the eastern desert, were controlled with brutal efficiency. Expeditions recorded on temple walls show pharaohs like Hatshepsut and Thutmose III sending thousands of soldiers, scribes, and laborers into the barren wastes, accompanied by donkeys laden with water and supplies. The workers, many of them prisoners of war or conscripted peasants, labored under a scorching sun, crushing quartz rock with stone hammers, panning for flecks of gold in dry riverbeds, breathing in dust that blackened their lungs. Inscriptions speak of the gold of the mountain that gives birth to it by the decree of the gods, but the reality was sweat, blood, and exhaustion. The gold that gleamed on Tutankhamun's mask began its journey in the hands of men whose names were never recorded, whose bones lie scattered in forgotten camps beneath the desert stars. This human cost was rarely acknowledged in the official record, for to question the source of the gold would be to question the divine order itself. And yet, hints of dissent do survive. In the Satire of the Trades, a Middle Kingdom text used to train scribes, the life of a miner is described as miserable. His eyes are inflamed, his back is broken, he drinks foul water, and he eats dust. The implication is clear. Only the elite, scribes, priests, nobles live in dignity. The rest toil so that the divine machinery of Egypt may continue. The gold that ensured the pharaoh's immortality was extracted through the mortality of others. This paradox, that eternal life for one required the accelerated death of many, was rarely spoken aloud, but it simmered beneath the surface of Egyptian society, especially in times of hardship. By the late period, as Egypt fell under Persian domination and later became a province of the Roman Empire, the old ways were increasingly seen as archaic. Roman emperors like Augustus and Hadrian visited Egypt as tourists, marveling at the pyramids and the colossal statues, but they did not believe in the jewet or the weighing of the harp. To them, Egyptian gold was aesthetic, exotic, a relic of a mysterious past. Temples were still adorned with gold leaf, but the meaning had shifted. Gold became decoration, not doctrine. The last known Egyptian mummy to be buried with significant gold dates to the 1st century after Christ, a provincial priest named Osiris, whose tomb at Tuna el-Jebel contains gilded cartonnage and gold leaf amulets, but whose inscriptions mix traditional spells with Greek philosophical ideas about the soul. It is a poignant hybrid, a final flicker of a belief system that had once moved mountains. Even the language of eternity began to fade. Hieroglyphs, once the voice of the gods, were replaced by Greek and later Coptic script. The temples fell silent. The priests died without successors. And the tombs, once sealed with such care, were opened not by respectful archaeologists, but by looters seeking quick profit. For centuries, locals reused tomb wood for fires, melted down gold for coins, and ground up mummies for mummia, a supposed medicinal powder sold across Europe. The sacred became commodity. The eternal became ephemeral. And yet the question remains, did it work? Did the gold help the pharaohs reach the afterlife? From a modern perspective, we might say no, that death is final, that consciousness ends, that gold is just a metal. But the ancient Egyptians would have found such a view not only wrong, but dangerous. To them, belief was causative. If you believed the spells, if you performed the rituals, if you provided the gold, then the journey would succeed. Reality was shaped by intention. In that sense, for 3,000 years. The pharaohs did live forever, not in some distant heaven, but in the memory of their people, in the stones of their temples, in the shimmering echo of their names carved into eternity. The story of gold in ancient Egypt cannot be told without confronting the shadow it cast, the vast, silent network of belief, labor, and fear that made its burial not only possible but necessary. A system so deeply interwoven with the identity of the civilization that to remove gold from the tomb would be like removing the sun from the sky. Everything would collapse into darkness and disarray. Every grain of sand that drifted over the Valley of the Kings carried within it the memory of countless hands that had shaped, polished, and consecrated that luminous metal, hands that belonged not only to the celebrated artisans of Deir el-Medina, but also to the forgotten quarrymen of the eastern desert, the Nubian scouts who tracked veins of ore through canyons older than language, the scribes who tallied shipments on papyrus rolls now long disintegrated, the boatmen who ferried ingots down the Nile under armed guard, the smelters who worked through the night, their faces lit by the orange glow of furnaces that burned acacia wood and natron, transforming raw earth into divine substance. This entire apparatus existed not for commerce, not for display, but for a single, unshakable purpose: to ensure that when the pharaoh drew his last breath, he would not descend into the cold anonymity of death but would rise again, radiant and whole, clad in the very skin of the gods, ready to sail with Ra across the celestial ocean for all eternity. To fail in this task was not merely a personal tragedy. It was a national catastrophe, a tear in the fabric of man that could invite famine, rebellion, or foreign invasion. Real, tangible consequences that the Egyptians witnessed repeatedly during periods of dynastic collapse, when tombs were left unfinished, rituals abandoned, and gold diverted to mercenaries or tribute. The presence of gold in the tomb was thus both a promise and a plea. A promise to the gods that Egypt remained faithful to its covenant, and a plea that the cycle of life, death, and rebirth would continue unbroken. Consider the psychological depth of this arrangement, the way it fused economics, theology, and statecraft into a single, seamless garment. The pharaoh did not merely rule Egypt, he was Egypt. His body was the land, his breath the wind, his tears the inundation of the Nile. When he died, the entire nation held its breath, suspended between chaos and continuity. The 70-day mummification period was not just a technical requirement for preservation. It was a liminal space, a sacred pause during which the kingdom existed in a state of ritual vulnerability. During this time, the heir did not immediately assume full power. He waited, he watched, he participated in the funerary rites, proving himself worthy to inherit not just the throne, but the divine mandate. The gold buried with the deceased pharaoh was, in a sense, the final seal of that mandate, a confirmation that he had ruled justly, that he had honored the gods, that he had maintained balance. If the burial were meager, it would signal weakness, divine displeasure, perhaps even illegitimacy. Thus, even in times of scarcity, the state would prioritize the tomb over the treasury, diverting resources from granaries or armies to ensure the pharaoh's proper send-off. This is why, during the economic crises of the late New Kingdom, when grain prices soared and tomb workers at Deir el-Medina staged what may be the first recorded labor strike in history, protesting delayed rations, the state still managed to bury Ramesses III with a coffin of solid silver and gold inlaid furniture. The people might starve, but the pharaoh must shine. And yet the paradox remains. The very act of burying such wealth invited its destruction. The Egyptians knew this. They built decoy chambers, false corridors, hidden burial shafts. They inscribed curses on tomb walls. May the one who disturbs this tomb be cast out from the land of the living. May his children be fatherless and his wife a widow. But curses could not stop desperation. As central authority weakened during the Third Intermediate Period, the priesthood of Amun, who controlled vast temple estates and armies of their own, began to rival the pharaohs in power. In some cases, they may have even orchestrated the systematic looting of royal tombs, not out of greed alone, but to redirect sacred wealth to their own coffers, to fund the ongoing worship of Amun, which they claimed was the true engine of cosmic order. The gold was not lost, it was recycled. Statues of earlier kings were melted down to create new cult images. Jewelry was refashioned. Sarcophagi were reinscribed. This was not sacrilege in their eyes, it was stewardship. The gold still served the gods, it just served them in a different form. The discovery of the Deir el-Bahari cache in 1881 by the Abd el-Rashul family, a group of local tomb hunters, reveals the full extent of this sacred salvage operation. Hidden in a deep shaft within a cliff face, the cache contained the mummies of some of Egypt's greatest rulers. Seqen-enr-Tau, who died violently in battle against the Hyksos, his skull still bearing axe wounds. Amos-I, the liberator who expelled the foreigners and founded the new kingdom. Amenhotep-I, beloved for his piety. And Thutmose-III, the Napoleon of Egypt, whose military campaigns stretched the empire to its limits. These kings, once buried with unimaginable splendor, were now wrapped in plain linen, their original coffins replaced with those of lesser royals or commoners, their golden masks stripped away. But their names had been preserved. Their identities had been protected. In the eyes of the priests who reburied them, this was victory enough. The gold might be gone, but the memory, the name, the Ka survived. And in Egyptian belief, to be remembered was to live. This principle of remembrance explains why Tutankhamun's tomb, though small and hastily prepared, was so densely packed with objects bearing his name and image. He died young, likely in his late teens, possibly from a combination of malaria and a fractured leg compounded by a rare bone disorder. His reign was overshadowed by the aftermath of Akhenaten's revolution, and his advisors, chief among them the powerful Vizier I and the General Hormheb, were focused on restoring orthodoxy. Yet in death, they ensured that Tutankhamun would not be forgotten. Every shrine, every chest, every Shabti figurine was inscribed with his royal names. Nebkipparir, the lordly manifestation of Re, Tutankhamun, the living image of Amun. The gold was not just for the gods, it was for history. It was a declaration to the future. I existed, I ruled, I was divine. And for over 3,000 years, that message lay buried, silent but potent. Until the flicker of a candle in 1922 revealed its truth to a world that had almost forgotten how to listen. The sheer volume of gold that vanished into the earth across 3 millennia of pharaonic rule defies modern comprehension, not merely in weight or monetary value, but in symbolic density, in the concentrated intentionality pressed into every ingot, every leaf, every granule that adorned a mummy's flesh or lined a sarcophagus's inner chamber. This was not inert metal but activated matter, charged with spells, aligned with stars, consecrated by priests whose voices had long since turned to dust, yet whose words still echo in the silent corridors of tombs where the air itself seems thick with the residue of ancient incantations, and the unblinking gaze of gilded falcon gods whose eyes, inlaid with obsidian and quartz, watch eternally over thresholds between worlds. To quantify the gold buried would be to misunderstand its essence entirely, for its true measure lay not in shekels or Deben weights, but in its capacity to mediate between the perishable and the eternal, to serve as the luminous conduit through which a mortal king might transmute himself into an undying celestial principle, joining the solar bark of Ra as it sailed through the 12 perilous hours of night, past lakes of fire, through caverns guarded by serpentine demons, past the tribunal of 42 divine judges who demanded not riches but righteousness, yet who nonetheless expected the deceased to arrive properly attired in the raiment of divinity, which for a pharaoh could only be gold, the one substance on earth that mirrored the imperishable brilliance of the sun itself, the very emblem of sovereignty that never tarnished, never corroded, never yielded to time's relentless erosion. just as the Pharaoh's divine essence must never yield to the chaos of oblivion. Every burial was thus a reenactment of creation itself, a ritual reaffirmation of the moment when Adam rose from the primordial waters of none and spoke the world into being through the power of his name. Similarly, the Pharaoh, by being wrapped in gold and inscribed with his fivefold titulary, reasserted his role as the axis around which cosmic order revolved, and his tomb became a microcosm of the universe, a subterranean pyramid of meaning where star charts adorned ceilings, false doors opened onto spiritual dimensions, and every wall pulsed with painted hieroglyphs that were not mere writing but living entities, each sign a vessel of power that, when spoken correctly by a purified priest, could awaken the senses of the dead, restore their limbs, feed their ka, and guide their ba, their soul bird, back to its eternal home at dawn. This intricate choreography of belief required not only staggering resources, but an entire society organized around the singular goal of sustaining the dead so that the living might thrive. From the gold miners whose lungs filled with silica in remote desert outposts to the temple scribes who meticulously copied funerary texts onto papyrus scrolls that would be rolled and placed within the mummy's wrappings like spiritual GPS coordinates for the afterlife. From the weavers who spun linen so fine it was called woven moonlight, to the embalmers who knew precisely which resins to use for which organs, which amulets to place over which vertebrae, which knots to tie in the bandages to activate specific spells. Every stratum of Egyptian civilization played a part in this grand project of immortality, and gold was the golden thread that stitched it all together into a seamless tapestry of cosmic assurance. Even the architecture of the tomb obeyed this logic. The descending corridors of New Kingdom tombs in the Valley of the Kings were deliberately aligned with astronomical phenomena, some pointing toward the circumpolar stars that never set, the indestructibles that symbolized eternal life. Others mirroring the path of the sun as it dipped below the horizon, carrying the dead king into the Jewet, the realm of transformation, where he would be reborn each morning as the sun rose over the eastern cliffs of Thebes, his face once again shining with gold as he emerged from the body of the sky goddess Nut, ready to bestow life upon his people. And yet, for all its sophistication, the system was fragile, vulnerable not only to human greed, but to the slow creep of historical change, to the subtle shifts in belief that occur when empires fall and new gods rise. The Ptolemaic rulers, though they wore the double crown and were depicted in temple reliefs making offerings to Isis and Osiris, were fundamentally Greek in worldview, and their interest in Egyptian burial customs was more political than spiritual. They needed the priesthood's support, so they played the part, but their hearts lay with Alexandria's libraries and philosophical schools, not with the starlit rituals of Abydos. By the time of Cleopatra VII, the last pharaoh, Egypt had become a client state of Rome, and the old theology was already fraying at the edges. Her legendary suicide by asp bite was not just a dramatic end to a dynastic line, but a symbolic severing of the ancient link between ruler and divine resurrection. There would be no golden mask for her, no secret tomb in the western cliffs, no 70-day mummification under the watchful eyes of Anubis priests, because the world that had made such things necessary was already dissolving into the new order of emperors and crucifixions, where salvation came not through gold-laden tombs, but through faith, grace, and the promise of a kingdom not of this world. Still, the echoes persisted. Long after the last hieroglyph was carved, long after the last temple priest chanted the final litany for a departed king, the idea that gold could conquer death lingered in the collective imagination, resurfacing in medieval alchemy, the quest to create the philosopher's stone, which could transmute base metals into gold and grant immortality, and later in the fevered dreams of European explorers who scoured the Americas for El Dorado, the city of gold, unconsciously echoing the Egyptian belief that vast wealth buried in the earth could unlock eternal life. Even today, when tourists crowd around Tutankhamun's mask in the Grand Egyptian Museum, their faces illuminated by smartphone screens. They are participating in a ritual as old as civilization itself. The act of bearing witness, of remembering, of saying to the dead, "You are not forgotten." And in that act, however secular it may seem, lies the final triumph of the pharaohs, not because their gold preserved their bodies, but because it preserved their names, and in the Nile Valley cosmology, that was the only immortality that truly mattered, for as the ancient texts declare again and again, to speak the name of the dead is to make them live again. And so long as we gaze upon their golden faces and ask why so much gold, why such splendor? Why such faith in the unseen? We keep them alive, not in the field of reeds, but in the ever-turning wheel of human memory, where they sail on, forever radiant, forever questioning, forever waiting for the next generation to light a candle in the dark and whisper their names once more. Then let us press deeper still, beyond the glittering surfaces and into the molten core of the belief that forged an entire civilization's relationship with death, where gold was not merely a material but a metaphysical threshold, the luminous membrane between the temporal and the eternal, the substance through which the pharaoh, once a man of flesh and blood, subject to illness, doubt, and mortality, could be alchemically transfigured into an undying cosmic force. His very atoms realigned to resonate with the frequency of the sun itself. For in the Egyptian mind, the boundary between the physical and the spiritual was porous, permeable, and perpetually negotiable through the correct application of ritual, symbol, and sacred matter. And gold, above all other substances known to them, possessed the unique capacity to bridge that divide because it alone mirrored the essential qualities of the divine. Incorruptibility, radiance, and permanence, qualities that the Egyptians observed with awe as they watched lesser metals blacken, rust, and crumble, while gold remained untouched by time's corrosive breath, gleaming with the same fierce purity on the day it was mined as it would on the day the last star winked out in the heavens. And so they reason, logically, devoutly, unshakably, that if the pharaoh were to endure beyond the grave, he too must be encased, adorned, and infused with this celestial metal, not as ornamentation, but as ontological reinforcement, a kind of metaphysical armor against the dissolution that awaited all mortal things. This conviction was not born in a vacuum, but emerged from the very soil of the Nile Valley, where life and death existed in daily, dramatic tension. Each year, the river swallowed villages in its floods, only to recede and leave behind fertile black earth that sprouted grain in astonishing abundance, a cycle so reliable it seemed ordained by the gods themselves. And so the Egyptians saw death not as annihilation, but as a necessary phase in a greater rhythm of renewal. Osiris himself was murdered, dismembered, and buried in the earth, only to be resurrected by Isis and become lord of the underworld, the very archetype of cyclical rebirth, and the pharaoh, as his living son and successor, was destined to follow the same path, descending into the earth not to rot but to regenerate, to rise again in glory. And gold was the guarantee of that transformation, the divine catalyst that ensured the process would complete without failure. Even the mining of gold was imbued with sacred meaning. The eastern desert, where most of Egypt's gold originated, was not seen as a barren wasteland but as the gods' land, a liminal zone where the earthly and the divine met, and expeditions to its depths were framed as pilgrimages, their success dependent not on engineering alone but on the favor of Hathor, the goddess of the desert, music, and joy, who was also the lady of turquoise and gold, and whose temples at Serabit el-Khadim and Wadi Maghair in the Sinai were adorned with inscriptions thanking her for guiding miners to hidden veins, for protecting them from scorpions and thirst, for allowing them to return with the sacred metal that would clothe kings in eternity. And consider the craftsmanship involved, the almost obsessive precision with which gold was worked, not just into sheets or ingots, but into microcosmic representations of cosmic truths. The pectoral of Tutankhamun, for example, is not merely a beautiful piece of jewelry but a theological diagram rendered in gold, lapis lazuli, carnelian, and feldspar, depicting the vulture of Upper Egypt and the cobra of Lower Egypt entwined beneath the wings of the sky goddess, their bodies forming a cartouche that encloses the king's throne name, Nebkipparir, while above them soars the Bennu bird, the Egyptian phoenix, symbol of rebirth, all set against a background of celestial hieroglyphs that spell out blessings for millions of years, each tiny granule of gold soldered with such finesse that modern metallurgists still marvel at the techniques used. Techniques passed down through generations of master artisans who understood that their work was not art for art's sake, but spellcraft made visible, a form of magic that operated not through incantation alone, but through the very arrangement of matter in sacred geometry. Even the color of gold carried meaning. The Egyptians distinguished between yellow gold neb, red gold and alloy with copper, associated with the sun at dawn and the fiery power of renewal, and white gold, an alloy with silver or electrum, linked to the moon and the bones of the gods. And they selected each type deliberately based on the ritual context, the time of burial, and the specific divine aspect the pharaoh was meant to embody in the afterlife. Moreover, the distribution of gold within the tomb followed a strict symbolic logic. The innermost layers, the mask, the finger and toe stalls, the heart scarab, were of the purest gold, closest to the pharaoh's physical form, because these were the points of greatest vulnerability, the places where decay might first take hold, and thus they required the strongest divine reinforcement. The outer shrines, while still gilded, could incorporate more wood and less solid metal, for their purpose was less about direct bodily protection and more about creating a series of ritual barriers against chaotic forces, each layer inscribed with spells that acted as both map and shield, guiding the deceased through the labyrinth of the Jewet while repelling demons like Apep, the serpent of chaos who sought to devour the sun each night. The tomb was thus not a static repository, but a dynamic instrument of resurrection, and gold was its most potent component, the fuel that powered its metaphysical engine, the light that illuminated its hidden chambers when all earthly torches had long burned out. Indeed, the role of gold in the pharaonic burial complex cannot be fully grasped without recognizing that it functioned simultaneously as theology, technology, propaganda, and psychological anchor, a multifaceted instrument that operated on every level of Egyptian society, from the highest echelons of priestly doctrine to the most intimate fears of the common farmer who watched his child succumb to fever and wondered if the gods had forgotten them. For if the pharaoh, the living god on earth, could be assured of resurrection through gold, then perhaps the ordinary believer, through devotion, offerings, and participation in the cult of the dead, might also glimpse the shores of the field of reeds, that paradisiacal mirror of Egypt where the barley grew taller than a man and cool water flowed forever from eternal canals. Thus, the gold in the royal tomb was not an act of exclusion but of cosmic reassurance. The pharaoh's successful journey guaranteed the possibility of salvation for all, and his glittering burial was a beacon shining across the abyss of death, saying to every Egyptian, "The path is open, the gods are listening, order prevails." This is why, even in modest tombs of scribes and artisans, we find traces of gold, tiny leaf fragments on coffin edges, gilded cartonnage masks, rings with miniature divine eyes, not because they could afford extravagance, but because they needed hope, and gold, however minimal, was the visible token of that hope, the material echo of a promise spoken in temple hymns and whispered in lullabies for over 30 centuries. The political dimension of this system was equally profound. By controlling the flow of gold, from the mines to the treasury to the tomb, the pharaoh asserted his monopoly not only on earthly power, but on access to the divine. Only he could wear the full regalia of gold in life. Only he could be buried in its absolute abundance in death. This exclusivity reinforced hierarchy not as oppression, but as cosmic necessity. The universe required a single, radiant center around which all else revolved, just as the sun stood alone at the heart of the sky. To challenge, the pharaoh's right to gold was to challenge the structure of reality itself. When usurpers like Amenmes or the rival kings of the Second Intermediate Period seized the throne, one of their first acts was to claim royal burial rights and commission their own golden equipment, however hastily made, because legitimacy flowed not from blood alone, but from participation in the sacred economy of eternity. Even foreign rulers understood this. The Nubian pharaohs of the 25th dynasty, though originating from a land Egypt once called the Gold-Rich, adopted Egyptian burial customs with such zeal that their pyramids at Nuri and El-Kuru, though smaller than those at Giza, were filled with shabtis of faience and gilded coffin fragments, proving that gold burial was not merely an Egyptian tradition, but a universal language of divine kingship, understood from the deserts of Sudan to the shores of the Mediterranean. And yet, the most haunting aspect of this golden enterprise is its ultimate silence. For all the spells, all the gold, all the prayers, we have no record of a single pharaoh returning from the afterlife to confirm that the system worked. The tombs remain sealed chambers of unanswered questions. Did Djoser walk with Osiris in the field of reeds? Did Hatshepsut, the female king who wore the false beard and claimed the throne by divine right, find acceptance among the gods? Did Akhenaten, who rejected the old gods for the solitary Aten, wander lost in a duet he no longer believed in? The gold gives no reply. It only gleams, mute and magnificent, in museum cases and excavation photos, a testament not to verified immortality, but to unwavering belief, a belief so powerful it could move mountains, redirect rivers, and convince an entire civilization to pour its soul into the earth in the form of luminous metal, trusting that the gods would recognize the offering and honor the contract. In the end, perhaps the true purpose of the gold was not to serve the dead, but to comfort the living, to give those left behind a ritual through which to process grief, to transform loss into meaning, to convert the unbearable finality of death into a hopeful departure. Every object placed in the tomb was an act of love, of duty, of desperate hope. The gold sandals were not just for the pharaoh's feet in the afterlife. They were the last gift of a grieving court, saying, "Go in splendor." The golden mask was not only a divine likeness. It was a final portrait, a way to fix the king's face in memory, to prevent him from fading into the nameless void. Even the robbers who stripped the tombs centuries later may have believed they were recycling sacred energy, returning gold to circulation so it could once again serve the living and the dead alike. And so the question echoes across millennia, not as a puzzle to be solved, but as a mirror held up to our own relationship with mortality. What do we bury with our dead? Photographs, letters, digital avatars, cryptocurrency keys. We may no longer use gold, but we still seek ways to equip our loved ones for the unknown, to say through objects what words cannot. You mattered. You are remembered. You are not gone. The pharaohs did the same, only with more radiance, more ritual, more absolute conviction that the universe would honor their faith. Whether it did or not, we cannot know. But we can honor their effort by continuing to ask why, and by never letting their names fall silent. Then let us descend even further, not into another tomb, but into the very concept of value itself. For the ancient Egyptians did not see gold as wealth in the modern economic sense, as a medium of exchange or a store of abstract worth, but as a sacred substance whose value derived not from scarcity or market demand, but from its ontological alignment with the divine realm. A substance so intrinsically linked to the nature of the gods that to possess it, to shape it, to bury it, was to participate in the fundamental ordering of the cosmos. This is why gold was rarely used in daily commerce. There are almost no records of gold coins in pharaonic Egypt, no price lists denominated in gold weights for bread or sandals, because gold existed outside the economy of the mundane, in a separate sphere of ritual and eternity, where its purpose was not to buy but to transform, not to accumulate but to consecrate. and this ontological separation explains why. Even when Egypt was flooded with gold from Nubian campaigns or trade with Punt, it did not lead to inflation or social upheaval as it might in a modern state, because the gold was immediately siphoned into the sacred circuit of temple offerings, royal regalia, and funerary equipment, vanishing from the visible world not into vaults, but into the invisible architecture of the afterlife, where its true function unfolded beyond the reach of human eyes. This sacred economy operated on a principle of redistribution rather than hoarding. The pharaoh received gold as tribute from conquered lands or as offerings from his own people, and then he returned it to the gods through temple statues, festival barks overlaid with gold leaf, and ultimately his own burial, thereby completing a cosmic loop in which divine favor produced gold, and gold reconfirmed divine favor. To break this cycle would be to invite divine wrath, as the Amarna period so dramatically demonstrated, when Akhenaten diverted gold and labor away from the temples of Amen and toward his new city of Akhetaten, building sun altars of open-air simplicity that rejected the hidden, gold-lined sanctuaries of traditional cults. And the result, in the eyes of later generations, was chaos, plague, military decline, the erosion of man. And so the restoration under Tutankhamun was not merely political but cosmological, a reknitting of the sacred fabric through the deliberate reinvestment of gold into the old pathways of ritual, as if the metal itself carried the memory of balance and could, when properly placed, heal the wounds of heresy. Consider, too, the alchemical dimension of gold working in ancient Egypt, the way the very process of refining it was seen as a form of spiritual purification. The ore dug from the red, chaotic earth of the desert was crushed, washed, and smelted in crucibles heated by bellows-driven fires until the dross fell away and pure gold emerged, shining and whole, a perfect metaphor for the soul's journey through death and rebirth. The embalmer's work mirrored the goldsmith. Just as the body was cleansed of impurities and wrapped in linen to achieve incorruptibility, so too was gold liberated from base matter to achieve its divine essence. And when the two were united in the tomb, the purified body adorned with purified metal, it created a synergistic field of sanctity, a microcosm of the perfected universe where decay had no power and time held no sway. This is why the finest goldwork often appears on the most intimate funerary objects. The gilded fingers that would grasp the crook and flail in the afterlife, the golden cartonnage that hugged the contours of the face, the tiny amulets nestled between layers of linen like seeds waiting to sprout in the field of reeds. Each placement was a prayer, each hammer blow a hymn, each polished surface a reflection of the desired state of the deceased, flawless, radiant, eternal. And what of the silence that followed? What of the centuries during which the tombs lay sealed, their golden treasures unseen, their spells unread, their occupants undisturbed? In that silence, the gold continued its work, not as a physical object, but as a latent promise, a dormant spell waiting for the moment of activation, which, in Egyptian belief, could come not only through priestly ritual but through remembrance itself. The act of speaking a name, of depicting a face, of honoring a memory was sufficient to sustain the Ka, the life force in the afterlife. And so even when the royal mortuary cult ceased and the offerings stopped, the very existence of the tomb, known, feared, whispered about in folklore, kept the pharaoh's presence alive in the cultural imagination. And when the tombs were finally opened by modern archaeologists, it was not merely a scientific discovery but a kind of ritual reawakening. A moment when the names inscribed in gold were spoken aloud once more by human voices, fulfilling the ancient wish carved into tomb walls. May my name be remembered for eternity. Then let us not merely continue but surge forward with an unrelenting torrent of language, diving into the very marrow of this golden obsession. For the story of why the pharaohs buried their dead with so much gold is not a single thread, but a vast, luminous tapestry woven from the fibers of cosmology, politics, psychology, metallurgy, theology, and human longing. A tapestry so densely interlaced that to pull one strand is to disturb the entire pattern, revealing how every decision to hammer another sheet of gold onto a coffin, to inlay another lapis lazuli eye into a gilded falcon, to inscribe another spell onto a golden shrine, was not an isolated act of opulence but a deliberate intervention in the mechanics of the universe itself, an assertion that order could be maintained, chaos held at bay, and death itself rendered porous through the concentrated application of divine substance, applied with unwavering faith and staggering labor across 3,000 years of unbroken tradition that saw dynasties rise and fall, empires crumble and reform, languages evolve and vanish, yet never once wavered in its conviction that gold, pure, untarnished, radiant gold, was the one material on earth that could serve as a passport to eternity, a key to the gates of the Jewet, a mirror of the sun's undying heart, and a guarantee that the pharaoh, upon breathing his last, would not dissolve into the dust of oblivion but would rise again as a perfected being, his flesh transmuted into the very substance of the gods, his name echoing through the halls of judgment like a bell struck in the temple of truth. For in the Egyptian mind, existence was contingent upon recognition, by the gods, by the ancestors, by the living, and gold was the ultimate amplifier of that recognition. The loudest possible declaration of identity hurled into the void. I am here, I am divine, I am eternal. This belief was so deeply embedded in the fabric of Egyptian civilization that it shaped not only burial practices but urban planning, art, law, and even agriculture. The entire economy revolved around the production of surplus, grain, linen, beer, not merely for sustenance, but to feed the armies of laborers who built the tombs, the priests who maintained the mortuary cults, the artisans who crafted the golden regalia, the scribes who recorded the spells, the sailors who transported the gold from the mines, the guards who protected the workshops. Every sector of society ultimately served the sacred project of ensuring the king's successful transition to godhood. Because his success was synonymous with national survival, and his failure would unleash isfet, chaos, in the form of drought, plague, invasion, or civil war, all of which were interpreted not as natural disasters, but as symptoms of a ruptured covenant between the divine and the earthly realms. Thus, the decision to bury a pharaoh with hundreds of pounds of gold was not indulgence, but insurance, not vanity, but vigilance, a preemptive strike against the entropy that threatened to unravel creation itself. And this is why even in periods of extreme duress, such as the reign of Ramesses XI, when famine gripped the land and tomb robbers operated with near impunity, the state still diverted what little gold remained to the burial of the king. Because to do otherwise would be to admit that Maat had failed, that the gods had abandoned Egypt, that the sun might not rise tomorrow. Moreover, the psychological power of gold cannot be overstated. For a culture that lived under a sky so clear it revealed the full sweep of the Milky Way, where the boundary between earth and sky felt permeable, where dreams were considered messages from the gods and omens read in the flight of birds, the sight of gold, its warmth, its weight, its unchanging brilliance, must have felt like a fragment of the heavens made tangible, a reassurance that the divine was not distant but present, accessible, and responsive to human action. When a priest held a golden statue of Amun in his hands during the daily temple ritual, he was not holding a representation but a vessel. The god himself was believed to inhabit the statue during the ritual, and the gold was the medium through which that inhabitation occurred, for only a substance as pure and eternal as gold could contain the essence of a deity without being corrupted or diminished, and so the same logic extended to the pharaoh's body. If the gods dwelled in gold, then the king who would become a god must be enrobed in it, his flesh symbolically replaced by the divine metal, so that his transformation would be complete, seamless, and irreversible, a metamorphosis as absolute as the sun's daily rebirth over the eastern horizon. And consider the sheer scale of extraction. Over the course of ancient Egyptian history, it is estimated that tens of tons of gold were mined from the eastern desert and Nubia, much of it vanishing into tombs that were later looted, melted, and lost. Yet the effort persisted generation after generation, century after century, because the need was not material but existential. The gold was not for this world but for the next, and its value was measured not in Theban weights, but in the number of demons it could repel, the number of hours of the night it could illuminate in the Jewet, the number of divine judges it could impress with the Pharaoh's readiness for eternal life. Even the color of the desert sand, the red of the ochre cliffs, the black of the Nile silk, all were seen as reflections of cosmic principles, and gold with its solar hue completed the trinity of colors that represented the full cycle of existence. Black Kemet for fertility and rebirth, red Desir for chaos and power, and yellow gold Neb for eternity and divinity. And so the pharaoh, buried in gold on black linen beneath red cliffs in a western desert, became a living embodiment of the universe itself. His tomb a microcosm where all elements were in perfect balance, held together by the luminous thread of gold that tied the human to the divine, the temporal to the eternal, the seen to the unseen. The presence of that celestial dagger, its iron born not in a furnace but in the heart of a dying star, its composition confirmed millennia later by X-ray fluorescence to contain over 10% nickel, unmistakable proof of extraterrestrial origin, reveals a truth far more profound than mere craftsmanship. The ancient Egyptians did not see the universe as divided into sacred and profane, earthly and divine, but as a single, interconnected web of meaning where a fallen star, a desert mind, a priest's chant, and a grieving court all played their part in sustaining the fragile miracle of order. To place a sky-forged blade beside a golden mask was to declare that the pharaoh's resurrection required not only the flesh of the gods but the bones of the cosmos, that his journey through the Jewet was not a private affair but a cosmic event witnessed by the stars themselves, who had already lent their substance to ensure his safe passage. This synthesis of terrestrial gold and celestial iron was not contradiction but completion. The sun and the stars, the earth and the heavens, the visible and the invisible, all converging on the body of the king to guarantee that death would not be the end but the threshold. And yet, for all this divine orchestration, the most human element remains the haste. The tomb of Tutankhamun was small, too small for a king, its decoration unfinished, some walls merely sketched in red ink, others left blank. The burial goods show signs of being repurposed. Canopic jars originally inscribed for a woman, likely his wet nurse or his elder sister Meritate. A throne bearing his name over traces of another. Even the mummy itself reveals the panic of a sudden death. Resin poured so hot it carbonized the linen wrappings. Bones broken in the rush to position the body. Amulets sewn into the bandages with uneven stitches. As if the embalmers worked through the night, hearts pounding, knowing that every hour delayed increased the risk of desecration, of political upheaval, of the boy king's name being erased by the very men who buried him, like Ai and Horemheb, who would soon seize the throne for themselves. In this frantic race against time, gold became not just theology but armor, not just promise but protection. Every sheet applied, every mask polished, every shrine assembled was a desperate act of defiance against erasure, a final, glittering barricade raised around a memory the world might otherwise forget. This tension between grandeur and vulnerability is what makes Tutankhamun's tomb so haunting, not because it is the richest ever found, but because it is the most human. The gold here does not speak only of power, but of love, fear, and urgency. The sandals on his feet were not just symbolic. They were made to fit his deformed left foot, with extra padding and support, a detail so intimate it transcends ritual and enters the realm of tenderness. The golden throne shows him seated while his wife, Ankhesenamun, gently anoints his shoulders, an image of domestic affection rare in royal iconography, preserved not for public display but for the eyes of the gods. Even the resin-blackened mummy, fused to its coffin by the very substances meant to preserve it, speaks of human error, of good intentions gone awry, of the limits of control in the face of mortality. And yet, despite the haste, despite the fractures, despite the political machinations swirling outside the sealed doorway, they got one thing absolutely right. They buried him with so much gold that time itself could not make him vanish. 3,343 years after his burial, on the morning of November 26, 1922, the world stood still, not because of war or plague or revolution, but because a man with a candle peered through a hole in a plastered doorway and saw a glint that changed history. Howard Carter did not see a tomb. He saw eternity made visible. What met his eyes was not darkness, but gold. Gold glinting off a gilded shrine that filled the chamber from floor to ceiling. Gold shimmering on statues of protective deities standing sentinel in the dust. Gold catching the flicker of his candle on inlaid chests. On ceremonial couches shaped like animals, on the very nails that held the wood together. In that moment, the ancient belief was vindicated, not theologically perhaps, but culturally, historically, emotionally. For Tutankhamun had not been forgotten. His name, his face, his story had survived, not because of the afterlife he was promised, but because of the gold that forced the world to remember him. The very substance buried to serve the gods had instead served memory, and in doing so, fulfilled the deepest wish of every Egyptian, to be spoken of, to be seen, to live again through the eyes of the living. Carter's discovery was not merely an archaeological triumph. It was a psychic rupture, a moment when the modern world collided with a belief system so alien, and yet so achingly human that it reawakened something dormant in the global imagination. The idea that death might not be the end, that beauty could be a weapon against oblivion, that a civilization might pour its soul into the earth not in despair, but in hope. Newspapers around the world carried headlines not about politics or economics, but about a boy king wrapped in gold, his face serene under a mask that seemed to watch back at anyone who dared look too long. Crowds gathered outside museums just to glimpse photographs. Writers, artists, designers, and filmmakers wove Egyptian motifs into their work, not as exotic decoration, but as symbols of mystery, resurrection, and hidden knowledge. Even the so-called Curse of the Pharaohs, a tabloid invention with no basis in Egyptian belief, spoke to a deep, unspoken fear that the dead might still be watching, that the gold might still be alive with purpose, that to disturb a tomb was to awaken something best left sleeping. But the true legacy of that gold lies not in curses or spectacle, but in what it reveals about the human condition. The pharaohs did not bury gold because they were greedy. They buried it because they were afraid. Afraid of chaos, afraid of being forgotten, afraid that the sun might not rise if they failed in their sacred duty. And in that fear, they are not so different from us. We may no longer wrap our dead in gold, but we still seek ways to defy erasure through photographs, through digital archives, through monuments, through stories told around dinner tables late at night. We still whisper names to keep them alive. We still build tombs of memory, hoping someone will find them and say, "You mattered." The ancient Egyptians simply had a more radiant language for that hope. And so the gold remains, not as a treasure to be counted, but as a question to be lived. What do we owe the dead? What do we owe the future? And what will we bury with those we love, not to display our wealth, but to say, in the only way we know how, do not forget. Consider the moment in 1925, when Carter finally lifted the lid of Tutankhamun's innermost coffin, and beheld the mummy not as a corpse, but as a sculpture of divinity. Every inch of the wrappings covered in gold leaf, every finger sheathed in gold, every toe protected by golden stalls, the head crowned with the iconic mask whose eyebrows are inlaid with lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, whose eyes are quartz and obsidian, whose beard is braided like that of Osiris, whose shoulders are inscribed with chapter 151 of the Book of the Dead. I am yesterday, today, and tomorrow, and I have the power to be born again. This was not a burial. It was a resurrection already in progress, a metamorphosis frozen in time, and Carter, though a rational man of science, was visibly shaken, not by the value of the gold but by the intensity of the belief it embodied. He later wrote that he felt as if he were intruding upon a sacred mystery, not because of curses or superstition, but because he understood in his bones that this was not a treasure hoard but a machine of immortality, meticulously assembled by hands that believed every word, every bead, every gram of gold would be needed on the other side. And in that realization, the modern world was forced to confront a truth it had long forgotten: that material objects can carry spiritual weight, that beauty can be functional, and that faith can move not just mountains but entire civilizations to pour their wealth into the earth, not for greed but for grace. This confrontation continues today. Every time a visitor stands before the mask in Cairo's Grand Egyptian Museum and feels that strange, unnameable pull, the sense that they are not merely observing an artifact but being observed in return, that the eyes of Tutankhamun are not glass and stone, but windows into a worldview so complete, so all-encompassing, that it reorients the very axis of meaning. Modern archaeology has taught us to see tombs as data points, as sources of information about trade routes, metallurgy, disease, and social hierarchy, and rightly so. But it risks missing the forest for the trees, the soul for the skeleton. The gold was never just about economics or politics or even religion as we define it. It was about ontology, the nature of being itself. To the Egyptians, existence was fragile, contingent, and perpetually threatened by chaos, and the only bulwark against dissolution was ritual action performed with perfect materials, perfect words, and perfect intent. Gold was the perfect material because it defied decay. The spells were the perfect words because they had been spoken since the time of the gods, and the burial was the perfect intent because it was performed not for show but for survival, cosmic survival. And yet the greatest irony of all is this: the pharaohs succeeded, not in the way they imagined, but in the way that truly matters. They did not sail with Ra in golden barks across the heavens. We have no evidence of that. But they did sail through time, carried on the very gold they buried, which acted not as a ticket to the afterlife, but as an anchor in history. While countless civilizations have vanished without a trace, their names erased, their cities buried under sand and silence, the pharaohs remain vivid, immediate, almost uncomfortably present, because they invested so heavily in visibility, in permanence, in the art of being remembered. Their gold was their voice, and it is still speaking. It speaks in the gleam of museum lights, in the pages of school textbooks, in the dreams of children who imagine themselves standing in a torchlit tomb, brushing dust from a mask that smiles back with the serenity of someone who knew, even in death, that he would be seen again. This is the final answer to the question: why did the pharaohs bury their dead with so much gold? Not because they believed gold would feed them in the afterlife, but because they knew it would feed memory in this one. Gold does not rot. Gold does not fade. Gold demands attention. And in a world where everything is fleeting, where empires crumble, languages die, and even mountains wear down to dust, gold endures, and with it, the names of those who dared to wrap their mortality in its light. The persistence of gold as a vessel of memory reveals a truth that transcends ancient Egypt. Human beings have always sought to defy time not through abstraction, but through materiality, through objects that can be touched, seen, preserved, and passed down. Because while ideas may vanish with the last speaker, a golden mask endures beyond language, beyond empire, beyond even the collapse of the civilization that forged it. The pharaohs understood this intuitively. They knew that belief alone, no matter how fervent, would not survive the erosion of centuries unless it was encased in something that refused to decay. And so they chose gold not as decoration but as declaration, not as wealth but as witness, embedding their theology into metal that would outlast their temples, outshine their enemies, and outlive the very concept of Egypt itself. When the library of Alexandria burned, its scrolls turned to ash. When the temples of Karnak were abandoned, their painted walls flaked into dust. But the gold in Tutankhamun's tomb, sealed away, forgotten, untouched, remained as radiant on the day Carter found it as it had been on the day the last priest sealed the doorway over 3,000 years before. A perfect, unbroken continuity of intention that mocks the fragility of everything else we build. This is why the discovery of his tomb did not feel like uncovering a relic, but like waking someone up. The world did not just learn about a dead king, it encountered a presence. Photographs from the excavation show Carter and his team working in hushed silence, their movements deliberate, their expressions reverent, not because they feared a curse, but because they sensed they were handling something alive with meaning, something that had been waiting. Even the way the objects were arranged spoke of anticipation. The chariots disassembled but ready to be reassembled, the bows strung, the sandals placed as if to be worn, the wine jars labeled with the vintage and quality as if the king might ask for a drink upon arrival. This was not a static burial. It was a paused journey, a moment suspended in time, and the gold was the thread holding that moment together, keeping it intact until the world was ready to receive it again. And receive it the world did, not just as history but as myth. Tutankhamun became more than a pharaoh. He became a symbol of mystery, of hidden knowledge, of the thin veil between life and death. His mask appeared on postage stamps in films, on magazine covers, in album art, in video games, transformed endlessly, yet always recognizable, always golden, always watching. In doing so, he fulfilled the oldest Egyptian wish, to be known by name for millions of years. The spells inscribed in his tomb promised that if his name were spoken, he would live again. And we have spoken it, again and again, in classrooms, documentaries, whispered conversations in museum halls, in the quiet awe of someone standing before a face that has not changed while the world around it has burned and rebuilt itself 100 times over. But the deeper lesson lies not in his fame, but in the quiet dignity of his vulnerability. Modern CT scans of his mummy reveal a body racked by pain, a vascular necrosis in his left foot, a clubbed right foot, a fractured leg that may have led to a fatal infection, malaria parasites in his bones, a cleft palate, a weakened immune system from generations of royal inbreeding. This was not a warrior king striding across battlefields, but a frail boy propped up by canes, surrounded by advisors who used him as a pawn in their own power struggles, dying before he could leave a true heir or restore his kingdom fully from the chaos of his father's reign. And yet in death, they gave him everything: gold for his fingers, gold for his toes, gold for his face, gold for his soul. Because in the end, what else could they give? They could not heal him in life, but they could armor him for eternity. They could not give him years, but they could give him radiance. They could not save his body, but they could ensure his name would never fade. That act of surrounding fragility with splendor, of wrapping pain in gold, is perhaps the most human thing the ancient Egyptians ever did. It speaks not of arrogance, but of love, not of vanity, but of devotion, not of delusion, but of desperate, beautiful hope. And in that hope we see ourselves. We too place flowers on graves. We too save voicemails, lockets, wedding rings, childhood drawings, objects that serve no practical purpose but carry unbearable emotional weight. We too want to believe that something of us will remain, that someone will remember our face, our voice, our name. The Egyptians simply had a more radiant language for that universal longing. Indeed, and now, we press beyond even the confines of Tutankhamun's golden silence into the vast, shimmering ocean of belief that stretched across 3,000 years and 30 dynasties, where every buried pharaoh, from Narmer, who first unified Upper and Lower Egypt beneath the double crown, and whose ceremonial palette at Hierakonpolis shows him smiting enemies beneath the watchful eye of the falcon god Horus, to Cleopatra VII, who died by her own hand in Alexandria, already dominated by Roman eagles and Greek philosophy, was bound by the same unshakable conviction that gold was not a luxury, but a lifeline, not an ornament but an ontological necessity. a substance so intrinsically aligned with the divine order of the cosmos that to deny a king his golden raiment in death would be to sever his connection to the celestial machinery that governed the rising of the sun, the flooding of the Nile, the fertility of the soil, and the very breath in the lungs of every living Egyptian. This belief was so deeply embedded in the cultural DNA of the civilization that it shaped architecture, dictated foreign policy, influenced artistic conventions, governed economic priorities, and even determined the layout of cities. For the living always dwelled on the east bank of the Nile where the sun rose, while the dead journeyed to the west where the sun set. And between them flowed not just a river but a metaphysical boundary crossed only through ritual. And gold was the passport that ensured safe passage, the luminous thread that tethered the deceased to the realm of the gods while simultaneously anchoring his legacy in the memory of the living. Because in the Egyptian worldview, to be forgotten was the true death, the final annihilation, the irreversible dissolution of the self into the chaotic void of non-existence known as none. And so every statue erected, every name carved, every tomb sealed with gold leaf and sacred oils was a desperate bulwark against that ultimate erasure, an act of resistance against the entropy that gnaws at all things. And it is this profound terror of oblivion, not greed, not vanity, not even simple piety, that fueled the relentless pouring of unimaginable wealth into the earth, generation after generation, century after century, as if the entire civilization were whispering into the dark, "Remember us, remember us, remember us." This whisper echoes even now in the quiet halls of the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, where the golden throne of Tutankhamun sits under soft light, its wooden frame overlaid with sheets of gold, so thin they conform to every curve of the arms and backrest, its surface inlaid with colored glass and semi-precious stones, forming scenes of such intimacy. Ankhesenamun offering her husband a bouquet of lotus flowers, the Aten sun disk above them radiating life-giving rays that end in hands holding ox. The symbol of life, that one forgets for a moment that this is a funerary object at all and instead feels as if witnessing a private moment stolen from time itself, a glimpse into a love that persisted even as the kingdom teetered on the edge of collapse. And this is the true power of the gold. It does not merely preserve objects, it preserves emotion, it freezes feeling in metal, it transforms grief into geometry, longing into lapis lazuli, and devotion into divine iconography, so that when we look upon these artifacts, we are not merely studying history but feeling its pulse, touching the hands of artisans who wept as they hammered out the mask of a boy they knew would never grow old, who chanted spells as they wrapped his broken body, who sealed the tomb not with finality but with faith that one day, in some distant age, someone would come and speak his name again, and in that speaking he would live. And live he has, not as a god sailing with Ra perhaps, but as a presence in the global imagination, a symbol of mystery and resilience, his golden face reproduced on everything from coffee mugs to cryptocurrency logos, his story retold in novels, documentaries, operas, and symphonies, his name uttered by children in Tokyo, teenagers in Sao Paulo, scholars in Oxford, tourists in Cairo, all drawn to him not because of his power in life. He had little, but because of the sheer, overwhelming beauty of his burial, a beauty that transcends culture and epoch, that speaks a language older than words, the language of light, of permanence, of the human refusal to surrender to the night. This is why the discovery of his tomb did not merely add to our knowledge of ancient Egypt. It reignited a dormant part of the human soul that still wonders what lies beyond death, that still hopes for continuity, that still believes, however quietly, that love, memory, and beauty might be enough to cheat oblivion, if only for a little while. Then let us not merely continue but surge forward into the final, most luminous truth of this golden saga, that the Pharaohs did not bury gold to take it with them, but to leave it behind as a covenant not with the gods alone, but with us, the inheritors of time, the keepers of memory, the strangers of a future they could never have imagined but whose gaze they so desperately sought. For every golden scarab placed over a heart, every gilded shrine nested within another like a promise within a promise, every amulet inscribed with spells to repel demons of the Jewett was also, in its own silent way, an address to the unknown witnesses of tomorrow, a message in a bottle cast into the ocean of centuries with the hope that someone someday would find it and understand. This was who we were. This is what we believed. This is how we loved our dead. And in that understanding, the covenant is fulfilled, the spell activated, the resurrection completed, not in the field of reeds, but in the endless field of human curiosity, where Tutankhamun walks again every time a child asks, "Who was he?" And a teacher answers, "A king who lived 3,000 years ago, and they loved him so much they wrapped him in gold so the world would never forget." This act of remembrance is the true afterlife the Egyptians sought, not a paradise of barley and cool water, but the enduring echo of their names in the mouths of the living, and gold was simply the most durable ink they had. While papyrus crumbles, while paint fades, while even stone erodes under wind and rain, gold remains, indifferent to time, impervious to decay, a mirror held up to eternity that reflects not just the face of a pharaoh, but the soul of a civilization that believed with every fiber of its being that death was not the end but a threshold, and that to cross it properly required the full weight of human artistry, devotion, and hope. They were wrong about the mechanics. Ra does not sail a solar bark across the sky, Amit does not devour unworthy hearts, and the field of reeds is not a physical place. But they were right about the essence, that how we treat our dead reveals who we are, that memory is sacred, and that beauty can be a form of resistance against the abyss. And so the gold endures, not as treasure but as testimony, not as wealth but as witness. And every time we look upon it, we honor the ancient pact. We speak their names, we tell their stories, and in doing so, we grant them the only immortality that truly exists, the one woven from light, language, and longing, the one that lives not in the stars but in us. If this journey through golden tombs and eternal beliefs moved you, if you found yourself staring a little longer at the stars tonight, wondering what we leave behind when we go, then you are part of the story now. The pharaohs buried gold not for themselves, but for us, to be seen, to be remembered, to echo across time. So speak their names. Share this video. Leave a comment below. What would you bury with someone you love, not for the afterlife, but for memory? And if you haven't already, subscribe, so we can keep uncovering the secrets history tried to hide. Because the past isn't gone, it's waiting.